Every single morning, a dog knocks on his neighbor's door, whining, waiting, desperate for someone to follow him. But his owner, a kind homeless man, has vanished without a trace. At first, people ignore the dog's plea, but when the woman who feeds him finally listens, what she discovers will shake the town to its core. A blood-stained backpack, a powerful man with secrets to hide, and a truth buried in the shadows. What really happened to the missing man? And why is his dog the only one who refuses to give up? Stay with us. This story will leave you speechless. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The first rays of sunlight crept over the sleepy town of Willow Creek as Annie Matthews pulled into her usual parking spot behind the cafe. Her breath made little clouds in the chilly morning air as she walked to the front door, her keys jingling softly. A few early birds chirped their morning songs from the bare branches overhead. The familiar squeak of the door's hinges broke the dawn silence. Annie flipped the sign from closed to open and breathed in the comforting stillness of her cafe. She'd done this routine so many times she could do it with her eyes closed, starting the coffee makers, laying out fresh pastries in the display case, and giving the counter one final wipe. The aroma of fresh ground coffee beans filled the air, promising another day of serving comfort to her regular customers. A soft whine caught her attention. Through the front window, she spotted Charlie, his black and white border collie fur ruffled by the morning breeze. The dog sat patiently by the door, his brown eyes fixed on her every movement, his tail completely still against the cold concrete. "Morning, Charlie," Annie said automatically, then paused. Something wasn't right. She looked around, expecting to see Tommy's tall, lean figure, in his worn jacket, broom in hand. But the sidewalk was empty, save for a few dried leaves skittering across the pavement. Annie stepped outside, the bell above the door chiming. "Tommy?" she called out, her voice echoing off the brick buildings. The alley behind her cafe was deserted, no sign of the quiet man who'd been sweeping her sidewalk every morning for the past 2 years. The morning air felt colder somehow, more biting than usual. Charlie whined again, pawing at the door. His usual calm demeanor was replaced with an anxious energy that made Annie's stomach twist slightly. But she shook her head, pushing away the worry. "He probably just found a warmer place to sleep," she muttered to herself, though the words felt hollow even as she spoke them. She filled a bowl with fresh water and set it down next to Charlie, adding a plate of yesterday's biscuits. "He'll be here soon enough, boy." Charlie's ears perked up at her words, but his eyes never left the street. The morning rush began right on schedule. Mrs. Peterson wanted her usual blueberry muffin and coffee with extra cream, chattering about her grandson's latest accomplishments. The high school teachers grabbed their to-go orders on their way to first period, their arms full of papers to grade. Mr. Johnson complained about his eggs being too runny, even though they were exactly how he ordered them, just like every other Tuesday morning. Between taking orders, making change, and refilling coffee cups, Annie barely had time to think about Tommy's absence. But every now and then, she'd catch a glimpse of Charlie through the window, still sitting guard at the door, barely touching his water or the biscuits she'd left out. His devotion made her heart ache. As the rush of customers thinned to a trickle, Annie found herself staring at Charlie more often. The dog hadn't moved from his spot, his eyes constantly scanning the street. The uneasy feeling she'd pushed aside earlier started to creep back, settling deep in her chest. She'd seen Tommy miss a morning here or there before, but Charlie had never acted like this. Something in the dog's unwavering vigilance spoke of more than just a simple delay. Annie wiped her hands on her apron, trying to focus on restocking the napkin dispensers. But her eyes kept drifting to the door, to the loyal dog waiting for his person, to the empty sidewalk that should have been swept clean by now. The morning sun had risen higher, but the shadows seemed longer than usual, darker somehow. The afternoon lull settled over the cafe like a heavy blanket. Annie mechanically wiped down tables, her movements slowing each time she glanced outside. Charlie hadn't moved. The untouched biscuits lay exactly where she'd placed them hours ago, now stale in the afternoon sun. A few crumbs had scattered across the sidewalk, attracting sparrows that Charlie didn't even bother to chase away. The dog's whimpers grew more insistent, his paws scratching at the glass door. Annie's chest tightened as she watched him. His usually bright eyes were clouded with worry, and his tail hung limp instead of showing its usual cheerful wag. "This isn't right," she muttered, untying her apron with trembling fingers. She flipped the sign to "Back in 30 minutes" and stepped outside, her heart heavy with concern. The spring air felt warm against her skin as she walked the familiar streets of Willow Creek. Cherry blossoms drifted lazily in the breeze as she made her way down Main Street. Her first stop was Miller's Grocery, where Tommy sometimes helped elderly customers with their bags, always refusing payment, but accepting their grateful smiles. "Haven't seen him since Saturday," Mr. Miller said, barely looking up from his crossword puzzle, tapping his pen against the newspaper. Figured he found another store to hang around. The church was next, its weathered stone steps where Tommy often sat during Sunday services. Father Patrick shook his head before Annie could finish her question, his kind face creasing with concern. The steps were empty all weekend. Is everything all right? At the gas station, Pete scratched his beard thoughtfully, leaning against the counter surrounded by candy bars and energy drinks. "Yeah, Tommy was here Saturday night. Helped some tourists with directions. Real nice guy. Haven't seen him since, though. Usually stops by for coffee in the mornings." Annie's stomach churned as she headed back to the cafe, her shadow stretching long behind her in the late afternoon sun. The bell above the door chimed as she entered, and she nearly collided with Greg, who was waiting by the counter in his crisp suit checking his expensive watch. "There you are!" He leaned in for a kiss, but Annie turned away, distracted by her growing unease. "I've been looking everywhere for Tommy," she said, moving behind the counter and fidgeting with the coffee filters. "No one's seen him since Saturday night. I'm worried." Greg's smile faded, replaced by a look of barely concealed disdain. "Tommy? The homeless guy who sweeps your sidewalk?" "Yes, and his dog Charlie hasn't left the door all day. He won't eat, won't drink. Something's wrong. This isn't like them at all." "Annie, honey." Greg's voice took on that patronizing tone she hated, the one he used when he thought she was being unreasonable. "He's transient. These people move around all the time. Maybe he just found another town with better handouts." "He wouldn't leave Charlie," Annie insisted, her voice rising slightly. "And he's not just some transient. He's been here for 2 years. He's part of this community. He knows everyone's names, their stories." Greg's jaw tightened, a muscle twitching beneath his clean-shaven skin. "Part of the community? He's a homeless man who sweeps your sidewalk for scraps. Why are you getting so worked up about this? It's beneath you." "Because he's a person, Greg. A kind person who might be in trouble. When was the last time you saw him help Mrs. Peterson with her groceries? Or play with the Wilson kids while their mom gets coffee?" "You're too soft-hearted for your own good." Greg straightened his tie, clearly irritated by her defiance. "We've got the charity gala coming up next week. That's what you should be focusing on, not some vagrant who probably just moved on to the next handout. Think about appearances, Annie." Annie stared at Greg, really seeing him for the first time. The perfectly pressed suit, the carefully styled hair, the cold look in his eyes. How had she never noticed before? The disconnect between his polished exterior and the ugliness of his words made her stomach turn. "I think you should go," she said quietly, her voice steady despite her trembling hands. "Annie, please, just go." That night, Annie lay in her bed, staring at the ceiling fan as it turned lazy circles above her. Charlie's desperate whining played on repeat in her mind, mixing with the gentle ticking of her bedside clock. The worry she'd been fighting all day settled deep in her bones, making sleep impossible. Something was terribly wrong, and nobody seemed to care except her and a loyal border collie who refused to abandon his post. As she rolled over, pulling the covers tighter around her shoulders, Annie knew this was more than just someone moving on. This was the beginning of something bigger, and she couldn't shake the feeling that tomorrow would bring changes she wasn't prepared for. The Tuesday morning sun cast long shadows across Main Street as Annie unlocked the cafe door, her keys jingling in the crisp morning air. Her movements were automatic, lacking their usual enthusiasm. She'd barely slept, tossing and turning all night with Tommy's absence weighing heavy on her mind. The dark circles under her eyes reflected in the cafe window as she pushed it open. Charlie lay in his usual spot by the entrance, his brown eyes following her every move with an intensity that made her heart ache. His fur was slightly matted, showing he hadn't moved much all night. When she set down a fresh bowl of water and some crispy bacon strips, he didn't even glance at it. Instead, he stood up with purpose, pressed his cold, wet nose against her hand, and tugged gently but insistently at her sleeve. "You want me to follow you, don't you?" Annie whispered, her voice barely audible in the quiet morning. Charlie's tail wagged once, his eyes pleading with an almost human-like desperation. She looked at her empty cafe, then at her watch, the hands pointing to just past 5:30. It was early. Most regulars wouldn't arrive for another hour, and the morning prep could wait. "Okay," she said, grabbing her worn denim jacket from the hook. "Show me." They checked the church first, their footsteps echoing on the empty sidewalk. The morning dew still clung to the worn stone steps where Tommy usually slept, creating dark patches on the granite. Empty. Father Patrick was sweeping nearby, his black cassock swaying with each movement. "Still no sign of him?" Annie asked, trying to keep the worry from her voice. The priest shook his head, leaning on his broom. "Sorry, Annie. I'll keep an eye out. Said an extra prayer for him this morning." Behind Miller's grocery, the alley was quiet, except for the monotonous hum of air conditioning units and the occasional flutter of paper caught in the wind. Tommy sometimes sorted bottles here, making neat piles that the store owner would collect. But today there was nothing but scattered leaves and empty cardboard boxes stacked haphazardly against the wall. At the gas station, Pete was restocking the cigarette display, his weathered hands moving mechanically through the familiar task. "Haven't seen him," he said, without looking up, his voice flat and disinterested. "Maybe he moved on to the next town. They usually do." "He wouldn't leave without Charlie," Annie insisted, her voice rising slightly, but Pete just shrugged, continuing with his work as if she hadn't spoken. They walked the entire main street, their pace quickening with each empty location. Charlie led her to every spot Tommy frequented, behind the hardware store where he'd sometimes help unload trucks, near the dumpsters at the Chinese restaurant where the cook would give him leftover soup, even the small park where he sometimes fed pigeons with bread crusts saved from his own meager meals. Nothing but empty spaces and forgotten corners. "Has anyone seen Tommy?" she asked everyone she met, from early morning joggers to delivery drivers. Most people barely paused in their morning routines, their responses ranging from indifferent to dismissive. "Who?" "Oh, the homeless guy? Nah, haven't seen him. Not that I was looking. He'll turn up somewhere else. They always do. That's what they're like, isn't it?" By the time Annie returned to the cafe, her frustration had turned to simmering anger that colored her cheeks. How could an entire town be so indifferent? Tommy had been here for years, helping where he could, never causing trouble. He'd shovel snow in winter and help elderly customers with their groceries. Yet people acted like he was invisible, a ghost they'd rather forget. She opened the cafe late, her regulars grumbling about their delayed morning coffee and disrupted routines. But Annie barely heard them, mechanically going through the motions of serving and cleaning. Her mind kept returning to Tommy's gentle smile, the way he'd sweep the sidewalk so thoroughly every morning, how he always had a kind word for everyone, even those who ignored him or pretended not to see him counting coins for a cup of coffee. Throughout the day, Charlie's behavior grew more frantic, his anxiety palpable. He paced restlessly in front of the cafe, barking whenever Annie appeared in the window, his normally calm demeanor replaced with visible distress. By closing time, his scratching at the door had become constant, desperate, his claws leaving marks on the fresh paint. As she wiped down the last table, the cloth moving in automatic circles over the laminate surface, Annie made up her mind. Tomorrow, she would check the riverbank where the willows drooped over the water. Tommy sometimes went there to fish, though she'd never seen him catch anything more than quiet moments of peace. The scratching continued as she locked up, Charlie's plaintive whimpers cutting through the evening quiet like a knife. She couldn't ignore this anymore. Wouldn't ignore it like everyone else. Something was wrong, terribly wrong, and if no one else cared enough to help, she would have to find Tommy herself. She owed him that much, and more. Annie paced her apartment, her phone pressed to her ear, her free hand running anxiously through her hair. "Greg, I have to check the riverbank. Something's wrong. I can feel it in my gut." "For heaven's sake, Annie." Greg's voice crackled through the speaker, dripping with frustration. "He's just some homeless guy. Why are you letting this consume you?" "Some homeless guy? He has a name, Greg. Tommy's been coming to my cafe for 2 years. He's kind. He works hard and he never asks for handouts." "This is exactly your problem," Greg cut in, his tone sharp and dismissive. "You get too involved. What will people think seeing you run around town looking for a vagrant?" Annie's hand tightened around her phone until her knuckles turned white. "Is that all you care about? What people think?" "I care about you making a fool of yourself. You're my girlfriend. It reflects badly on me." "Reflects badly?" Annie's voice shook with barely contained anger. "A man is missing, and you're worried about your image. Let the police handle it." "The police won't do anything. No one cares except me and Charlie." "That mangy dog? Don't." Annie's voice turned to ice, cutting through the air like a blade. "Don't you dare!" Greg showed up at her door 20 minutes later, his face flushed with anger, tie askew from rushing over. Their argument escalated quickly, filling the small apartment with harsh words and rising voices. "You can't save everyone, Annie." He grabbed her shoulders, fingers digging in. "You need to stop obsessing over this." She shrugged him off, taking 2 steps back. "Don't touch me." "Fine." Greg threw up his hands, face red with fury. "Chase after your homeless friend. But don't expect me to stand here and watch you throw everything away." He stormed out, slamming the door so hard the windows rattled and picture frames shook on the walls. Annie stood in the sudden silence, trembling from head to toe. Charlie whined softly, pressing against her leg, his warm presence steadying her. She looked down at his worried brown eyes and made a decision. "Come on," she whispered, grabbing her flashlight and car keys from the hook by the door. "Let's go find Tommy." The riverbank was eerily quiet when they arrived, with only the soft rushing of water and distant cricket chirps breaking the silence. Her flashlight beam cut through the darkness, dancing over moss-covered rocks and twisted tree roots. Charlie trotted ahead, his nose to the ground, leading her along the muddy shore with determined purpose. They walked for 10 minutes before Charlie stopped abruptly. He pawed frantically at something half buried in the mud, whimpering with increasing urgency. Annie's flashlight beam settled on the object, illuminating it in harsh detail. Her heart stopped, then started hammering against her ribs. It was Tommy's backpack, the same worn olive-green one he carried everywhere. The canvas was torn open, as if by violent hands, and dark stains spread across the fabric. Blood stains, fresh ones. Annie's hands shook as she stared at the ruined backpack, the beam of her flashlight trembling in the darkness like a trapped firefly. Annie's hands trembled as she lifted the muddy backpack from the riverbank. The familiar canvas was torn open, its contents scattered like broken pieces of Tommy's life. Charlie whined, pressing his nose against the bag, his tail drooping with concern. "Oh, God," she whispered, her flashlight beam revealing more details she wished she hadn't seen. Dark stains marked the fabric. Blood, she was sure of it now. The rusty brown patches stood out against the faded green material, making her stomach churn violently. Kneeling in the mud, she gathered the scattered items with reverent care. A sodden blanket that Tommy always kept folded just so, the corners perfectly aligned even in his hardest times. His journal, its pages torn and water-damaged, some missing entirely, the careful handwriting now bleeding into illegible smears. These weren't just possessions. They were everything Tommy owned in the world, carried with quiet dignity through countless difficult days. Charlie's sharp bark made her jump. He faced the tree line, hackles raised, body tense and alert. Annie swung her flashlight toward the shadows, but saw only darkness between the trunks, branches swaying slightly in the night breeze. Still, her skin prickled with the feeling of being watched, that creeping sensation of hidden eyes tracking her every move. With shaking fingers, she pulled out her phone and called Greg. It rang 4 times before going to voicemail. She tried again, her heart sinking further with each unanswered ring. Nothing. "Fine," she muttered, dialing 911. The dispatcher's voice was flat, uninterested, almost bored. "I've found evidence that something's happened to a missing person," Annie explained, trying to keep her voice steady. "There's blood." "Name of the missing individual?" The dispatcher cut in, typing sounds clicking in the background. "Tommy Rivera. He's—" Annie hesitated, hating how her next words might affect Tommy's chances. "He's homeless?" A pause, heavy with judgment. "Ma'am, we'll take a report, but homeless men disappear all the time. They move on, find new places." "This is different." Annie's voice rose, echoing in the dark. "There's blood on his bag. His things are scattered." "We'll send someone to take a report in the morning." The line went dead. Annie stared at her phone in disbelief, anger and fear mixing in her chest like a toxic brew. Charlie pressed against her leg, whimpering softly, his warm presence the only comfort in the cold night air. She looked at the torn backpack in her hands, then at Charlie's worried eyes, seeing her own concern reflected there. The police wouldn't help. Greg wouldn't help. But she knew someone who might. Someone who'd seen enough corruption in his time to know when something wasn't right. Someone who still believed in justice, even after everything he'd been through. Frank Delaney, the retired detective who came to her cafe every morning, who always had a kind word for Tommy, who watched the town with knowing eyes that missed nothing. She'd seen the way he noticed things, how he pieced together the subtle wrongness that others overlooked. She clutched the backpack closer, its dampness seeping through her jacket. She wouldn't sleep tonight, but at least now she had a plan. a first step toward finding out what had happened to Tommy. The morning sun cast long shadows across Frank Delaney's front porch as Annie stood there, clutching Tommy's torn backpack. Her knuckles had barely touched the weathered door when it swung open, revealing Frank's weathered face, creased with the wisdom of years spent investigating crimes. His sharp eyes took in her disheveled appearance and the mud-stained bag in her hands, missing nothing in his assessment. "Something's wrong, Frank," Annie said, her voice barely above a whisper, trembling with worry. Frank studied her for a moment, noting the dark circles under her eyes and her rumpled clothes, then stepped aside. "Come in." His kitchen was simple but tidy, with worn linoleum floors and faded curtains that spoke of a life lived without fuss. The smell of fresh coffee filled the air as Frank poured 2 mugs, his movements deliberate and careful, like everything else about him. Annie sat at the small table, placing the backpack between them like a piece of evidence. "Tell me everything," he said, sliding a mug toward her, his expression grave. Annie's words tumbled out. Charlie's desperate behavior, Tommy's unusual absence, her fruitless searches around town. She described Greg's dismissal and the police's indifference, her voice rising with frustration. Her hand shook as she pushed the backpack toward Frank, coffee forgotten. "Found this by the riverbank last night. It was half buried in the mud." Frank's lined face grew serious as he examined the bag, his experienced eyes catching details others might miss. His fingers traced the torn fabric, lingered over the dark stains that looked worryingly like blood. He'd seen enough violence in his career to recognize the signs, and these signs made his stomach turn. "That's not just a missing person, Annie," he said quietly, his voice heavy with concern. "That's a crime." He looked up at her, his eyes sharp with purpose. "When was the last confirmed sighting?" Annie thought back, her stomach tightening with each passing second. "Saturday night? Maybe. I'm not even sure about that anymore. Everything's becoming a blur." Frank's jaw clenched, a muscle twitching in his cheek. 4 days. He's been missing 4 days, and nobody's looked. He leaned back, his coffee untouched, growing cold. If someone hurt him, and no one's looking, that means they think no one cares. Or worse, they're counting on it. Annie's eyes filled with tears, her voice thick with emotion. "I care." Frank nodded, rising from his chair with newfound determination. He grabbed his coat from the hook by the door, the leather worn but sturdy like its owner. "We're going to the police station. Let's see if they still want to ignore this when a former detective starts asking questions." The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as Annie and Frank entered the Willow Creek police station. A receptionist barely glanced up from her phone as they passed. In the detective's area, Paul Harris sat hunched over paperwork, his coffee-stained desk cluttered with files. "Detective Harris," Annie said firmly, "we need to talk about Tommy Rivera." Harris sighed without looking up. "I already told you, ma'am. People like that leave all the time." Frank stepped forward, placing Tommy's backpack on the desk. "Take a look, Paul." Harris glanced at the bag, his expression unchanging, even as Frank pointed out the bloodstains. "You don't know that's his blood," he said, leaning back in his chair. "Maybe he got into a fight and left town. These people, they drift in and out." "These people?" Frank's voice carried an edge. "If this were a businessman's briefcase, would you be this lazy about investigating?" Harris stiffened, finally meeting Frank's gaze. "Watch yourself, Delaney." "You're not on the force anymore." "No," Frank agreed, "but I remember what real police work looks like." Annie stepped closer to the desk. "Someone hurt him, you know it, and you're choosing to ignore it." After a tense moment, Harris pulled out a form. "Fine. I'll file an official missing person report. But don't expect miracles. We've got limited resources. The way he filled out the form, slowly, carelessly, made it clear this would go nowhere. Annie's hands clenched into fists as she watched him. When they walked out into the afternoon sun, Frank turned to Annie. "We need to talk to some people. The cops won't." Frank's old pickup truck rumbled up the winding driveway of Victor Langley's estate. Pristine hedges and manicured lawns stretched in every direction. Annie's stomach tightened as they approached the massive house with its gleaming windows and stone columns. Victor Langley emerged onto his wraparound porch, dressed in an expensive suit despite the early hour. His steel gray hair was perfectly styled, but his eyes were cold as he looked down at them. "I don't do charity cases," he called out before they could reach the steps. Frank stepped forward, his voice steady. "We're here about Tommy Rivera." "The homeless man?" Victor's lip curled. "Yeah, I saw him. He was trespassing on my property." Annie moved closer, Charlie at her heels. "What did you do?" "I had him removed." Victor straightened his tie, seemingly bored with the conversation. "Removed how?" Frank took another step up, and Annie noticed Victor's security guard shift in the doorway behind him. Victor's face hardened, all pretense of civility dropping away. "He left town. That's all you need to know." Charlie let out a low growl, the fur on his neck rising. Victor glanced at the dog, then back at Annie and Frank, his expression darkening. "Listen carefully," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "I'd stop asking questions if I were you. This is a small town. You don't want to make enemies." The threat hung in the air like a storm cloud. Annie felt her heart pounding, but kept her eyes locked on Victor's face. She saw something there, a flash of satisfaction when he mentioned Tommy's removal. Back at the car, Annie gripped the steering wheel until her knuckles turned white. "He's lying. Tommy never left town." Frank nodded grimly. "Which means someone wanted him gone." Annie's footsteps echoed across her small apartment as she paced back and forth, Victor Langley's threats playing on repeat in her mind. Charlie lay on the worn carpet by her feet, his brown eyes following her movement, his tail thumping softly against the floor whenever she passed. The sudden buzz of her phone made her jump. Greg's name flashed on the screen. Annie stared at it, her finger hovering over the answer button. After 3 more rings, she finally picked up. "What were you thinking?" Greg's voice was sharp. "Why were you at Victor Langley's estate?" Annie's free hand clenched into a fist. "We were asking questions about Tommy." "You're making a scene, Annie. Do you have any idea how this looks for me?" His words came out clipped, controlled, but she could hear the anger underneath. "A man is missing, Greg. He's been missing for days," Annie's voice rose. "And Victor Langley knows something about it." Tommy was a drifter. You don't even know if something happened to him. Greg's patience snapped. "You need to stop before you ruin your reputation and mine." The words hit Annie like a slap. She sank onto her couch, Charlie immediately moving to rest his head on her knee. "Is that all you care about? Your career?" Greg let out an exasperated sigh. "I'm trying to protect you, but if you want to waste your time, go ahead." The line went dead. Annie stared at the phone in her hand, her vision blurring with angry tears. Charlie whined softly, nudging her arm with his nose. The truth she'd been avoiding settled heavily in her chest. Greg would never support her in this. He cared more about maintaining his image than doing what was right. Her fingers tightened around the phone, her jaw clenching. She was on her own. Annie rolled over in bed for what felt like the 100th time, her mind racing with thoughts of Tommy, Victor's threats, and Greg's betrayal. The digital clock on her nightstand blinked 2 a.m. in harsh red numbers. Charlie paced back and forth near her bedroom door, his nails clicking against the hardwood floor. Suddenly, Charlie's whole demeanor changed. He rushed to the door, scratching frantically at the wood and letting out sharp, urgent barks. His whining grew louder, more insistent than she'd ever heard before. "Charlie, shh," Annie whispered, sitting up in bed. "You'll wake the neighbors." But Charlie wouldn't stop. He ran between the door and her bed, his tail low, his eyes wide with desperation. Annie switched on her bedside lamp, running a tired hand through her messy hair. The dog darted to the window, pressing his nose against the glass and staring intently into the darkness. Annie joined him, peering out into the empty street below. The streetlights cast yellow pools on the sidewalk, but nothing moved in their glow. Still, something felt off. A chill ran down her spine, despite the warmth of her apartment. "It's probably nothing," she muttered, more to convince herself than Charlie. But the dog's behavior was different this time, more urgent, more focused. He returned to the door, pawing at it and looking back at her with pleading eyes. Annie stood in the middle of her bedroom, doubt and exhaustion warring in her mind. She should just go back to bed. It was the middle of the night, and she was probably just on edge from everything that had happened. Charlie's whine cut through her thoughts, low and desperate. Okay, Annie sighed, grabbing her jacket from the hook behind her door. She slipped it on over her pajamas and found her flashlight in the kitchen drawer. Her hands trembled slightly as she checked the batteries. The rational part of her brain screamed that this was crazy, following a dog into the night based on nothing but a feeling. But after everything that had happened with Tommy, she couldn't ignore Charlie's instincts again. Annie slipped on her shoes and gripped the flashlight tightly. "All right, Charlie," she whispered, reaching for the door handle. "Show me what's wrong." The moment she opened the door, Charlie bolted into the hallway. Annie hurried after him, her heart pounding as they descended the stairs and stepped out into the cold night air. The first hints of dawn painted the sky in shades of gray as Annie followed Charlie through the quiet streets. Her flashlight beam bounced off empty storefronts and darkened windows. Charlie moved with purpose now, his nose close to the ground, leading her toward the edge of town. The abandoned factory loomed ahead, a hulking shadow against the lightening sky. Broken windows gaped like missing teeth, and rust streaked down the metal walls like old tears. Annie's footsteps crunched on gravel as they approached the main entrance. Charlie stopped abruptly, his fur standing on end, a low growl rumbling in his throat. Annie's hands trembled as she aimed her flashlight at the padlocked door. The chain hung loose, broken. Her heart thumped against her ribs as she pushed the heavy door open. It creaked on rusty hinges, the sound echoing through the empty space. Inside, stale air filled her lungs. Dust motes danced in her flashlight beam. Her boots crunched on broken glass and debris as she followed Charlie deeper into the building. Old machinery cast strange shadows on the walls, and the wind whistled through broken windows. Charlie circled an area near some old crates, his nose working frantically. Annie knelt beside him, brushing aside pieces of broken concrete and years of dust. Her breath caught in her throat. Dark stains marked the concrete floor. Blood. Her trembling fingers found something else. A scrap of familiar brown fabric, torn and dirty. She recognized it immediately. The corner of Tommy's old coat. "Oh, God," she whispered, her voice barely audible. A sudden scraping sound echoed through the factory. Annie's whole body went rigid. Her flashlight beam darted to the corner of the building, catching a shadow moving in the darkness. She stayed perfectly still, hardly daring to breathe. Her heart pounding so loud she was sure it could be heard across the empty factory floor. Charlie's growl deepened, his eyes fixed on the same corner where the shadow had moved. Annie's fingers gripped the flashlight tighter, her palms sweaty. The silence stretched, broken only by the whisper of wind through broken windows and the blood rushing in her ears. Something, or someone, was in here with them. Annie burst through the cafe door, her face pale and hands shaking. Frank sat at the counter, coffee untouched, his weathered face creasing with concern as she rushed toward him. "We need to talk," she said breathlessly, gripping the counter to steady herself. Frank leaned forward, his voice low. "What happened?" Annie's words tumbled out in a rush. She told him about following Charlie to the factory, about the broken lock, the bloodstains on the concrete floor, and the torn piece of Tommy's coat. Her voice cracked when she described the shadowy presence she'd sensed in the darkness. "Someone was there, Frank. I could feel it." Frank's expression darkened as he absorbed every detail. His fingers tapped against his coffee cup, a habit Annie had noticed when he was deep in thought. "We need to keep digging," he said firmly. "This is bigger than—" The bell above the door chimed. Melissa walked in, wringing her hands. Her usual cheerful demeanor was replaced with nervous energy as she approached them. Annie noticed how she wouldn't quite meet their eyes. "You need to stop asking questions, Annie," Melissa blurted out, her voice barely above a whisper. Annie stared at her friend, confusion written across her face. "What?" Melissa shifted from foot to foot, still avoiding eye contact. "I told Victor you were looking into this. He said it's dangerous." Annie's stomach dropped. The cafe seemed to tilt sideways for a moment as the implications sank in. Frank tensed beside her, his hand gripping his coffee cup so tight his knuckles turned white. "You talked to Langley?" Frank's voice was sharp. Melissa's eyes filled with tears. "I thought I was helping you. I thought if I warned him you were asking questions, he might back off." Frank stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "You just tipped off the one man who wants this buried." Annie watched as Melissa's face crumpled with guilt. The morning's fear morphed into something worse, the realization that they weren't just searching for answers anymore. Now they were being watched. Frank grabbed his keys from the counter. "We need to move fast, before they do." Annie sat at her kitchen table, staring at her phone. Greg's number glowed on the screen, but her finger hovered over the call button. What was the point? He'd already made it clear where he stood. The thought made her chest ache, but she pushed it aside. Charlie paced near the door, his nails clicking against the hardwood floor. A deafening crack of thunder made her jump. The windows rattled as wind whipped through the trees outside. Rain started hammering against the glass. First a few drops, then a sudden downpour that turned the world beyond her windows into a gray blur. Charlie's anxious pacing turned into frantic barking. Before Annie could reach him, he was scratching wildly at the door, letting out high-pitched whines she'd never heard from him before. "Charlie, what's wrong?" She reached for him, but the moment she opened the door, he bolted into the darkness. "Charlie!" Annie grabbed her yellow raincoat from the hook and snatched up her flashlight. Her heart pounded as she chased after him, rain immediately soaking through her jeans. The beam of her flashlight bounced wildly across empty sidewalks and shuttered storefronts. Lightning flashed, illuminating Charlie's dark shape ahead. He was running toward the abandoned factory, his paws splashing through growing puddles. But halfway there, he suddenly veered left, heading toward the outskirts of town. Annie's shoes squelched in the mud as she followed him down the slope that led to the old storm drain. The concrete tunnel gaped like an open mouth in the hillside, water rushing out of it in torrents. "Charlie!" she called again, her voice nearly lost in the storm. The dog stopped at the entrance, barking frantically. Annie's flashlight beam cut through the rain, scanning the area around the drain. That's when she saw it, pale fingers protruding from beneath a pile of wet leaves and debris. a human hand. Annie's breath caught in her throat, her flashlight beam frozen on those motionless fingers. Annie lunged forward through the rain, her hands trembling as she tore at the pile of debris. Wet leaves and splintered wood gave way beneath her desperate fingers. Charlie dug alongside her, his paws scrabbling at the mud. "Tommy!" Her voice cracked as she finally cleared enough debris to see him. He lay crumpled in the drain, his face pale and bruised in the beam of her flashlight. His clothes were soaked through, plastered to his too thin frame. Annie's medical training from years ago kicked in. She pressed shaking fingers against his neck, holding her breath until she felt it. A pulse. Weak and thready, but there. "Please, please, be okay," she whispered, checking his breathing. It was shallow, but he was alive. Charlie whimpered softly, nudging Tommy's face with his nose and giving it gentle licks. The dog's loyalty made Annie's heart ache as she fumbled for her phone. Frank answered on the first ring. "Annie?" "I found him," she choked out. "He's alive, but barely. We're at the old storm drain near the factory." "Don't move him. I'm coming." The minutes felt like hours until Frank's truck appeared, headlights cutting through the rain. He jumped out, splashing through puddles to reach them. "Jesus," he muttered, kneeling beside Tommy. Together, they carefully extracted him from the drain. His right leg was bent at an unnatural angle, and his skin felt like ice. As they lifted him, something fluttered from his clenched fist. Annie snatched it up, a torn scrap of paper, its edges ragged. Even in the dim light, Victor Langley's name was clearly visible on the letterhead. "Frank," she said, holding up the paper with trembling fingers. "Look at this. Whatever Tommy found out about Langley—" "Later," Frank cut her off, already lifting Tommy's limp form. "Right now, we need to get him to a hospital. Now!" The emergency room doors burst open as Annie and Frank rushed in with Tommy's limp form between them. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as nurses immediately swarmed around them, their faces tight with concentration. "Get him on the gurney, Stat!" a nurse called out, her voice sharp and professional. Charlie tried to follow as they wheeled Tommy away, his nails clicking frantically on the linoleum floor. Annie caught him by the collar, her heart breaking at his desperate whine. "BP's dropping," someone called out as they disappeared behind swinging doors. A doctor in blue scrubs approached, clipboard in hand. "I'm Dr. Martinez. Can you tell me what happened?" Annie's mind went blank. We found him in a storm drain. He was unconscious, cold." "How long was he out there?" "I don't know." Annie's voice cracked. "He's been missing since Saturday night." "Any medical conditions we should know about? Allergies? Medications?" Annie looked helplessly at Frank. I don't know anything." The realization hit her hard. She'd served Tommy coffee every morning for months, but she knew nothing about his medical history, his family, his life before Willow Creek. "We'll run a full panel, Doctor," Martinez said, scribbling notes. "Oh, you did the right thing bringing him in." Annie stepped outside, the cool morning air hitting her face. She ran her hands through her tangled hair, still damp from the rain. Frank followed, his weathered face grim as he watched the sunrise painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. "Someone tried to kill him, Annie." Frank's voice was low, certain. "And they almost got away with it." Annie pulled out the crumpled paper from her pocket, the document they'd found clutched in Tommy's hand. The letterhead was torn, but Victor Langley's name was clearly visible. "We need to find out what this means," she said, studying the fragment. Frank nodded grimly. Whatever Tommy stumbled across, someone thought it was worth killing him to keep it quiet. Annie stared down at the paper in her hands, her fingers trembling slightly. The piece of evidence felt impossibly heavy for such a small scrap of paper. Sunlight streamed through the hospital window, casting gentle shadows across Tommy's pale face. Annie sat in the hard plastic chair beside his bed, fighting exhaustion. She hadn't left his side since they brought him in, watching his chest rise and fall with each shallow breath. Charlie lay curled at her feet, his tail thumping softly against the floor when Tommy's fingers twitched. Then, slowly, Tommy's eyes fluttered open. "Tommy?" Annie leaned forward, her voice barely above a whisper. His gaze wandered the room, confusion giving way to recognition. He tried to speak, but only managed a dry rasp. Annie quickly poured him a cup of water, helping him take small sips. "You're safe now," she said, gently taking his hand. The bruises on his face had darkened to ugly purple marks, and his split lip was still swollen. Tommy's eyes darted to the door, then back to Annie. Fear crept into his expression. They were going to kill me?" His voice was rough, breaking on each word. Frank stepped closer to the bed. "Was it Victor Langley?" Tommy nodded weakly, his hand trembling in Annie's grip. "I was collecting cans behind the factory." He paused, struggling to catch his breath. Heard voices. A meeting. They were talking about money. Millions of dollars. Moving it around, hiding it. "Laundering money?" Frank asked quietly. Tommy nodded again. "Saw papers. Contracts. Victor saw me." His voice cracked. "His men caught me, beat me, threw me in that drain. Left me to die." Annie squeezed his hand, feeling anger burn in her chest. "You're going to be okay, Tommy. I swear." Tears welled in Tommy's eyes. "Nobody was supposed to find me. Nobody was supposed to care." "Well, we do care," Annie said firmly, "and we're not going to let them get away with this." Frank straightened up, pulling out his phone as he walked toward the hallway. "We're taking this to the press." Annie's footsteps crunched on broken glass as she approached her cafe. The afternoon sun caught the jagged edges of her shattered front window, sending prisms of light dancing across the sidewalk. Charlie stood guard outside, his hackles raised despite his wagging tail at her approach. "Oh no," she whispered, her hand flying to her mouth. Frank placed a steady hand on her shoulder. "Let me go in first." They stepped carefully through the doorway. The destruction inside made Annie's heart sink. Her beautiful cafe, the place she'd poured her heart into for years, was completely trashed. Overturned tables littered the floor. Chairs lay broken against walls, and coffee cups lay shattered everywhere. But it was the message on the wall that made her blood run cold. In angry red spray paint, the words "Stop asking questions" screamed at her. Charlie's low growl echoed through the destroyed space. Annie's hands trembled as she pulled out her phone. "Victor's warning us," she said, dialing Greg's number. Frank nodded grimly. "This means we're getting too close." The call went straight to voicemail. Annie was about to try again when the bell above the door chimed. Greg stormed in, his face red with anger. "I told you to stop," he shouted, gesturing wildly at the destruction. "Look what you've done." Annie stared at him, really seeing him for the first time. The way his hands shook, the sweat on his forehead, the panic in his eyes, it all clicked into place. "You knew," she whispered. "You knew what Victor was doing. All along." Greg's silence spoke volumes. He wouldn't meet her eyes, instead focusing on a broken coffee mug by his feet. Frank stepped closer to Greg, his voice low and dangerous. "You know something, don't you?" Greg's mouth opened, then closed, but no words came out. The truth hung heavy in the air between them, unspoken but unmistakable. Annie watched Frank's fingers fly across his keyboard, the morning light streaming through his dusty office window. Stacks of papers and old records covered every surface, creating a maze of information they'd been sorting through since dawn. Charlie lay by the door, his watchful eyes following their movements. "Look at this," Frank said, turning his monitor. "Victor's been running money through 3 different shell companies." He pointed to a complex web of transactions. Each one leads back to those empty lots near the factory. Annie leaned closer, her eyes scanning the documents. "But why would he need shell companies for empty lots?" "Because they're not really empty." Frank pulled up another document. "According to these permits, he's planning to build luxury condos. The land value will skyrocket once it's rezoned." Annie's breath caught as Frank opened another file. There, in black and white, was Greg's signature on the rezoning approval. "No," she whispered, her hands gripping the back of Frank's chair. "Greg signed off on this?" Frank nodded grimly. 3 months ago, the paperwork was rushed through, bypassing normal channels. He shuffled through more documents. "And look here, donations to Greg's campaign fund from all 3 shell companies." Annie's legs felt weak. She sank into a nearby chair, her mind reeling. "So when Tommy was at the factory that night..." "He must have overheard something about the money laundering," Frank finished. "Victor couldn't risk that getting out." Charlie padded over to Annie, resting his head on her knee. She absently stroked his fur, trying to process the betrayal. "Greg was protecting Victor this whole time?" Her voice cracked slightly. Frank turned away from his computer, his expression serious. "This goes deeper than we thought, Annie. Greg's been helping Victor hide millions in illegal profits." Annie stared at the documents scattered across Frank's desk, each one a piece of evidence showing Greg's true nature. All those times he dismissed her concerns about Tommy, tried to stop her investigation. It hadn't been about protecting her at all. Frank reached for his phone. "We need to bring this to the press before it's too late." Annie sat in her dimly lit apartment, her phone heavy in her hand. The evidence against Victor and Greg felt like a weight pressing down on her chest. Charlie lay at her feet, his head resting on her shoes, offering silent comfort. A sharp knock made her jump. Through the peephole, she saw Greg's familiar silhouette. Her hand trembled as she opened the door. Greg burst in, his usually neat appearance disheveled, his tie loose around his neck. "Annie, please," he said, running his hands through his hair. "You need to stop. This is bigger than you." She crossed her arms, feeling a cold anger settle in her chest. "You knew, Greg. You knew all along." "It's politics," he said, spreading his hands. "Sometimes you have to make tough choices. Victor's too powerful. If you expose him, you won't just ruin him. You'll ruin me, too." Annie watched him pace, seeing him clearly for the first time. His expensive suit, his perfectly polished shoes, his carefully crafted image. It was all a facade hiding a scared, selfish man. "You're scared of losing everything," she said softly. "But I'm not." Greg's face hardened, his desperation turning to ice. "If you go through with this, we're done." Annie straightened her shoulders, feeling stronger than she had in days. "We've been done for a long time." His jaw clenched. He stared at her for a long moment, then turned and stormed out, slamming the door behind him. Charlie whined softly. Annie reached down to scratch his ears, then picked up her phone and dialed Frank's number. "Let's go public." The town hall buzzed with nervous energy as people filed in, filling every seat. Camera crews set up their equipment while reporters scribbled in notepads. Victor Langley sat in the front row, his expensive suit crisp and perfect, a slight smile playing on his lips. Annie's hands trembled slightly, but her voice remained steady as she whispered to Frank, "Are you sure about this?" Frank nodded, clutching a manila folder. It's time. The mayor called the meeting to order, and Frank stepped up to the podium. His voice carried through the packed room, clear and unwavering. Victor Langley has been laundering money through false charities, Frank announced, laying out document after document. He orchestrated illegal land deals that have cost this town millions. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Victor's smile didn't falter, but his knuckles whitened as he gripped his armrest. Annie stepped forward next, her heart pounding, but her voice strong. And when Tommy Rivera overheard something he wasn't supposed to, Victor had him attacked and left for dead. Gas echoed through the room. People turned to stare at Victor, who stood up smoothly, adjusting his tie. "This is slander," he said, his voice dripping with contempt. "There's no proof, just the word of a homeless man and a cafe owner who's clearly lost her mind." Frank reached into his pocket and pulled out a small recorder. "Actually, we have more than that." The recording played crystal clear through the speakers. Victor's voice filled the room, discussing money laundering schemes and ordering his men to take care of the homeless problem. The color drained from Victor's face. The crowd erupted in angry shouts. Camera flashes exploded across the room. Victor grabbed his briefcase and stood to leave, but two police officers stepped forward, blocking his path. One pulled out handcuffs. "Victor Langley," the officer announced, "you're under arrest." Annie watched as they led Victor away, his perfect facade finally crumbling. Annie stepped into Tommy's hospital room, her heart lifting at the sight of Charlie immediately jumping onto the bed. The border collie's tail wagged furiously as he gently licked Tommy's hand. Tommy's eyes fluttered open, and he winced slightly at the morning light streaming through the window. "Hey there," Annie said softly, settling into the chair beside his bed. Tommy tried to shift position, grimacing at the pain from his broken leg. His face was still bruised, but the swelling had gone down considerably. The steady beep of the heart monitor filled the quiet room. "Victor Langley was arrested yesterday," Annie told him, keeping her voice gentle. "The whole town knows what he did now. He can't hurt anyone else." Tears welled in Tommy's eyes as he processed the news. His voice came out hoarse and shaky. I thought I was dead. In that drain, I couldn't move, couldn't call for help." Annie reached out and squeezed his hand. "You made it, Tommy. You fought. And Charlie," she smiled at the dog who hadn't left Tommy's side. "Charlie never gave up on you. Not for a second." Tommy looked at his faithful companion, then back at Annie. His chin trembled. "I don't deserve this kindness. Look at me. I couldn't even defend myself. I'm just a homeless man who—" "Stop," Annie said firmly but kindly. "You survived something terrible. That means something. You're stronger than you know." Tommy's eyes filled with fresh tears. "I let myself become nothing. I lost everything and just gave up." "You never became nothing," Annie insisted. "You were kind to everyone in town. You helped people even when you had nothing to give. That's not nothing, Tommy. That's everything." Charlie nuzzled closer to Tommy, resting his head on his owner's lap. Tommy's free hand automatically went to scratch behind the dog's ears. "I want ... Tommy's voice cracked. He took a deep breath and tried again. "I want to start over." Annie turned the key in the cafe's lock, the familiar click echoing in the quiet evening air. The street lamps cast long shadows across Main Street, and a cool breeze rustled the leaves overhead. Then she heard footsteps behind her. She spun around to find Greg standing there. Her breath caught in her throat. He looked nothing like the polished deputy mayor she'd known. His shirt was wrinkled, his tie loose, and dark circles shadowed his eyes. "I lost everything, Annie," he said, his voice cracking. "The mayor asked for my resignation. No one will hire me. My reputation is ruined." Annie crossed her arms, keeping her distance. "You did that to yourself, Greg. You chose to help Victor Langley. You chose to look the other way when someone needed help." He stepped closer, and she caught the faint smell of whiskey on his breath. "We were good together, weren't we?" His eyes were pleading. "Remember how happy we were? You don't have to be alone. We could start over." Annie's stomach churned as clarity washed over her. All those years together, and she finally saw the truth. Greg had never loved her. He'd only loved what she represented, the perfect supportive girlfriend who made him look good, someone he could control. "No," she said firmly. "We weren't good together. I just couldn't see it before." "Annie, please." He reached for her hand, but she pulled away. "I need you." "That's the problem, Greg. You only care about what you need. You never once asked what I needed. You never cared about doing what was right, only what was convenient." His face hardened, that familiar mask of arrogance slipping back into place. "You're making a mistake." "No," Annie shook her head. "My mistake was not seeing you for who you really are sooner." Greg stared at her for a long moment, then turned and walked away. His shoulders slumped. Annie watched him go, feeling lighter than she had in years. The weight of pretending, of compromising her values to keep him happy, finally lifted from her shoulders. The morning sun streamed through the cafe windows, painting golden stripes across the freshly wiped tables. Annie hummed softly as she arranged pastries in the display case, each movement feeling lighter than before. The weight that had pressed on her shoulders for so long, Greg's manipulation, Victor's threats, the constant worry, had finally lifted. Charlie lay by the door in his usual spot, but his tail wagged with an easy contentment. The coffee machine hummed, filling the air with its rich aroma, and Annie breathed it in deeply. Everything was the same, yet somehow completely different. The bell above the door chimed. Tommy stood in the doorway, backlit by the morning sun. He looked different, clean-shaven, wearing pressed khakis and a blue button-down shirt. His bruises had faded, and though he still walked with a slight limp, he held himself straight and tall. But his eyes were uncertain as they met Annie's, and his hands fidgeted with his sleeve cuffs. "I don't know if I belong here," he said softly, his voice catching. Charlie bounded up, tail wagging furiously as he circled Tommy's legs. Annie smiled, warmth filling her chest. "You do." Tommy's shoulders relaxed slightly, but he still hesitated at the threshold. Annie walked around the counter and gestured to his usual spot, the corner table by the window, the one that caught the morning light just right. "The usual?" she asked, already reaching for a mug. Tommy nodded, lowering himself carefully into the chair. Charlie settled at his feet, head resting on Tommy's shoe. The morning light caught the silver in Tommy's hair, and for the first time, Annie saw peace in his eyes, fragile but real. She poured a steaming cup of coffee and carried it to his table. "Welcome home," she said softly, setting it before him. The corners of Tommy's eyes crinkled as he smiled, and Charlie's tail thumped happily against the floor. The afternoon sun warmed the bustling cafe, filling it with golden light. The usual crowd filled the tables, Mrs. Peterson with her romance novel, Mr. Jenkins solving his crossword puzzle, and the young couple who always shared a slice of apple pie. But Annie's attention kept drifting to the corner table, where Tommy sat watching the scene before him with thoughtful eyes. Charlie lay at Tommy's feet, his tail thumping softly against the wooden floor. The dog hadn't left Tommy's side since that morning, as if making sure his human wouldn't disappear again. Annie wiped her hands on her apron and walked over to Tommy's table. From behind her back, She pulled out a neatly folded black apron, identical to her own. She placed it on the table with a gentle smile. "You still got that job offer?" she asked, her voice warm and steady. Tommy stared at the apron, his weathered hands hovering over the fabric. His fingers trembled slightly as he touched it, as if checking whether it was real. Then slowly, a smile spread across his face, hesitant at first, then growing stronger. "You mean it?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Annie nodded. "The morning rush could use an extra pair of hands, and you already know how everything works around here." Tommy picked up the apron, running his thumb over the cafe's embroidered logo. His eyes glistened with emotion, but his smile remained steady. Charlie's tail wagging picked up speed, sensing the joy radiating from his owner. "I won't let you down," Tommy said, standing up and unfolding the apron. "I know you won't," Annie replied simply. Tommy slipped the apron over his head, tying it with careful precision. He stood straighter, looking more alive than Annie had ever seen him. "All right, boss," he said, his voice stronger now. "Where do I start?" The Sunday morning sun painted the cafe in shades of amber and gold. Annie leaned against the counter, watching the light dance across the polished surfaces. The quiet before opening was her favorite time of day. Just her, the gentle hum of the coffee machines, and Charlie sleeping peacefully at her feet. She glanced down at the border collie, his chest rising and falling in steady breaths. For the first time since that terrifying week, Charlie seemed completely at ease. No more anxious pacing, no desperate scratching at doors. He knew his family was whole again. The bell above the door chimed softly. Tommy walked in, his apron already tied neatly around his waist. His shoulders were straight, his steps confident. The haunted look that had shadowed his eyes for so long had faded, replaced by something warmer, more alive. Charlie's tail thumped against the floor in greeting, but he didn't move from his spot. He didn't need to anymore. Tommy was exactly where he belonged. Annie watched as Tommy picked up an order pad and moved toward a table where early customers had just settled. His voice was clear and steady as he took their order, making easy conversation about the weather and the morning specials. No trace remained of the man who had once hesitated to meet anyone's eyes. The morning light streamed through the windows, wrapping the three of them in its warm embrace. Annie felt something settle in her chest, a deep contentment she hadn't known she was missing. This was what home felt like. This was what family meant. And it all started with a dog who refused to give up, who knew something was wrong and wouldn't rest until his human was safe. Charlie had brought them together, had shown them what loyalty and love really meant. Annie moved to stand beside Tommy near the window. Charlie padded over, sitting between them, his presence steady and sure. Together, they watched the sun climb higher in the sky, painting the world in possibilities. Tommy reached down to scratch Charlie's ears. "Thank you, boy," he whispered, "for everything." Charlie leaned against his leg, tail wagging softly. He knew. He had always known. The three of them stood there, bathed in morning light, their shadows stretching behind them. The past was where it belonged, behind them, and ahead, nothing but open sky and endless possibility. If you enjoyed the story of Annie, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.